U.S.-Iran latest nuclear talks end with limited progress, as Tehran sources express skepticism. Iran and the United States concluded a fifth round of high-stakes nuclear talks in Rome on Friday, amid growing skepticism in Tehran about the chances of a deal as Washington hardens its position. A senior Trump administration official said Friday more talks are needed, and both sides agreed to meet in the near future. The talks continue to be constructive. We make further progress, the official said, but there is still work to be done. The U.S. side said the discussions, which were participated by Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff, lasted more than 2 hours. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said Friday's nuclear talks with the U.S. are too complicated to be resolved in 2 or 3 meetings. He said, however, that Iran and U.S. delegations have completed one of the most professional rounds of negotiations. In a televised interview on state-run IRIB News, 2 Iranian sources have told CNN the talks seem unlikely to lead to an agreement, with the U.S. insisting that Tehran dismantles its uranium enrichment program, a demand Iranian officials say would cause the nuclear negotiations to collapse. The sources said Iran's participation in the Rome talks was solely to gauge Washington's latest stance, rather than pursue a potential breakthrough. Araghchi reiterated Tehran's red lines before he departed for Rome on Friday. Figuring out the path to a deal is not rocket science, he posted on X before his flight. Zero nuclear weapons equals we do have a deal. Zero enrichment, we do not have a deal. The Trump administration has demanded Iran stop all uranium enrichment activity, which Witkoff says enables weaponization. Uranium, a key nuclear fuel, can be used to build a bomb if enriched to high levels. Iran maintains that its nuclear program is peaceful and says it is willing to commit not to enrich uranium to weapons grade as part of an agreement. Araghchi met on Friday with Omani Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi in Rome during the continuation of this round of talks, and the 2 ministers reviewed the latest status of today's talks and consultations on how to continue the work, Iran's foreign ministry said in a statement. The time and place of the next round of talks will be determined and announced later, the statement added. U.S. officials have yet to comment publicly on the outcome of Friday's talks. Al-Busaidi, who mediated the talks, said, "We hope to clarify the remaining issues in the coming days to allow us to proceed towards the common goal of reaching a sustainable and honorable agreement," in a post on X on Friday. Iran preparing for Plan B on Saturday, a senior Iranian lawmaker told CNN that Tehran is disappointed with the progress of nuclear talks and is considering a Plan B if they fail, although he did not specify what it would entail. "We do not have hope yet, because the American side is still insisting on zero enrichment, and I know the Islamic Republic of Iran will never agree with zero enrichment," Ebrahim Rezaieh, a member of the parliament's National Security and Foreign Policy Committee, said in an interview at the Iranian parliament Saturday. "I got disappointed and do not have much hope that the negotiations will lead to a deal. We are preparing for Plan B." Rezaieh said it was too early to judge whether the talks could succeed. "So far we have not seen much seriousness on their U.S.'s part," he added. Speaking Thursday, Araghchi said Iran was open to enhanced monitoring by international inspectors, but would not relinquish its right to pursue nuclear energy, including uranium enrichment. Washington is offering to wind back crippling economic sanctions on Iran in exchange for denuclearization. The U.S. had previously sent mixed signals about whether Iran would be allowed to enrich uranium, but in recent weeks it has hardened its stance, insisting that no enrichment will be permitted. That shift has urged officials in Tehran to question Washington's commitment to a deal, as Iran has repeatedly said enrichment is a red line in negotiations. The 2 Iranian sources told CNN that Tehran harbors mounting doubts about the U.S.'s sincerity in talks. The media statements and negotiating behavior of the United States have widely disappointed policymaking circles in Tehran, the sources said in a joint message. From the perspective of decision-makers in Tehran, when the U.S. knows that accepting zero enrichment in Iran is impossible and yet insists on it, it is a sign that the U.S. is fundamentally not seeking an agreement and is using the negotiations as a tool to intensification pressure. Initially, the sources noted, some Iranian officials believed Washington might seek a win-win compromise. However, a consensus has emerged that the Trump administration is steering discussions toward a deadlock. The sources say that although neither the US nor Iran wants to leave the negotiating table, the position of the US is making the talks unproductive, and formal meetings are unlikely to continue much longer. They said that Tehran no longer serious US efforts to distance itself from Israel's hardline stance on Iran, and it sees proposals made by the American side as following the agenda of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has insisted that no enrichment be allowed in Iran. Witkoff on Friday met with Ron Dermer, a confidant of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, in Rome on the sidelines of talks, a source familiar with the meeting told CNN. U.S. imposes more sanctions before talks med. Washington has kept up the pressure on Iran with fresh sanctions and threats of war, even as diplomat talks continue. On Wednesday, the U.S. State Department announced new measures, identifying Iran's construction sector as being controlled directly or indirectly by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, and 10 strategic materials that it said Iran is using in connection with its nuclear, military, or ballistic missile programs. With these determinations, the United States has broader sanctions authorities to prevent Iran from acquiring strategic materials for its construction sector under IRGC control and its proliferation programs. State Department attendee Tammy Bruce said. Iran's foreign minister criticized U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio for the move, calling it as outrageous as it is unfair and inhuman. The U.S.'s consecutive rounds of sanctions only reinforce our people's deeply held belief that the American decision-makers are set to make every malign effort to hinder Iran's development and progress. These sanctions, announced on the eve of the fifth round of Iran-U.S. indirect talks, further put to question the American willingness and seriousness for diplomacy. Bakai wrote on X. A misreading of Iranian psychology. Ali Vez, Iran project director at the International Crisis Group in Brussels, said there is a misguided perception in Washington that a sick Iran is more likely to compromise. The weaker Iran is, the more reluctant it will be to make major concessions, he said, adding that it is unlikely that Tehran will agree to a deal that is based solely on U.S. terms. That's a complete misreading of Iranian psychology, Vez said. For Iran, capitulation is seen as a worse than an Israeli strike on its nuclear facilities, he added. Iran would be reluctant to make concessions from a position of weakness, because if it does so, then it will put itself on a slippery slope that could result in regime collapse, Vez said. Multiple American officials told CNN this week that the U.S. has obtained new intelligence suggesting that Israel is preparing to strike Iranian nuclear facilities, even as the Trump administration pursues a diplomatic deal with Tehran. But threats of war will only lead to Iran doubling down on its current position, Sanam Vakil, director of the Middle East and North Africa program at London's Chatham House think tank, told CNN. The best way to invigorate the talks would be through back-channeling and quiet discussions between both sides. In an interview with CNN's Jim Sciutto on Thursday, U.S. Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee signaled potential American support for Israel's nuclear plans under the right conditions. I can't imagine the U.S. would object to a sovereign nation defending itself against what they perceive as a legitimate threat to their very lives, Huckabee said. He acknowledged that the U.S. is aware Israel is making preparations for potential military action. We are certainly aware of what the Israelis are at least preparing for, but it's not that they have made a firm decision. I think they recognize they face an existential threat from Iran. Experts say an Israeli attack on Iranian nuclear facilities would likely spell the end of its negotiations with the U.S., and could even remind Tehran to withdraw from the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, NPT, which promotes nuclear disarmament. Trita Parsi, executive vice president of the Quincy Institute in Washington, D.C., said the Trump administration has unnecessarily walked themselves into a dead end by insisting on zero enrichment, fueling the idea that Israeli strikes will follow if Iran doesn't back down. Iran, he added, is probably not taking those threats seriously. But if they do materialize in the midst of nuclear talks with the U.S., he said, Tehran is likely to respond with massive retaliation. They won't play the patience game any longer, Parsi said. If the Israelis were to do anything, it has to be clearly understood that it is not about destroying the program at this point, because they don't have that capability. Parsi added, it is only about destroying diplomacy. This story has been updated with additional developments. Iran is open to compromises on its nuclear program in talks with the United States, but uranium enrichment remains non-negotiable. Tehran's foreign ministry attended told CNN, indicating Washington understood this position. If the intention is to make sure that Iran's nuclear program will not be weaponized, I think that's something that we could simply do, Esmail Bagay, the investigator for Iran's foreign ministry, said in Tehran on Monday. Asked by CNN how a compromise can be reached in talks, Bagay said, so many ways, without specifying. However, he added that Iran's right to nuclear energy would have to be protected, echoing the long-standing Iranian position on talks. If the U.S. intention is to deprive Iranians of their right to peaceful nuclear energy, I think that would be very problematic to the extent that I think it would really challenge the whole process, he added. After U.S.-Iran talks inch forward with the fifth round of negotiations in Rome on Friday, President Donald Trump voiced optimism Sunday that progress was being made. We had some very good talks with Iran yesterday and today, and let's see what happens. But I think we could have some good news on the Iran front, Trump told reporters in New Jersey as he was preparing to return to Washington. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi called the talks one of the most professional rounds of negotiations yet, but said the key issues were too complicated to be resolved in 2 or 3 meetings. While the Trump administration has been bullish on its demand that Tehran end all uranium enrichment, essential for both civilian and military nuclear applications, Bagay said U.S. negotiators' behavior in talks suggests a softer approach. The fact that so far we have continued our talks means that we understand there is a certain level of understanding that Iran cannot under any circumstances give up its right to peaceful nuclear energy, he said. In March, Rafael Grossi, the head of the United Nations nuclear watchdog IAEA, said Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium had increased by half in 3 months. Iran is the only non-nuclear weapon state enriching to this level, causing me serious concern, he said. Room for hope. Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei publicly dismissed the chances of a deal and goaded U.S. negotiators ahead of Friday's talks. Try not to talk nonsense, he urged them in a post attributed to him on his official website last week. But Bagay was optimistic about the chances of a U.S.-Iranian accord, foreseeing a win-win for both sides. If really there is a will, there's ways, he said. There is not only one way, there are so many ways. Multiple American officials told CNN last week that the U.S. has obtained new intelligence suggesting that Israel is preparing to strike Iranian nuclear facilities, even as the Trump administration pursues a diplomatic deal with Tehran. Bagay said Iran was resolute before the threat of unilateral Israeli military strikes on Iran. Iranians will not be supportive of any sort of pressure, he said. When it comes to using that language, Iranians will come with one voice, and we will certainly defend our national security.